Sorry, I just spoiled the position we're going to get into, but I apologize if this recording is a little bit long. I really wanted to go in depth with this game because I feel like there was a lot to learn. Opening of the day, Staunton Gambit, and I found this game to be particularly instructive. So we get a Staunton Gambit setup, and all of this is theory until this point. They play F3, which is almost like a Smith-Morra in a way. So when you play like a Smith-Morra, you play D4, C3, and then you develop your knight quickly into C3 by sacking two pawns. That's very similar to what's happening here, but Black doesn't want to allow that. Doesn't want to allow quick and easy, progression for the knight, and so they basically give up the pawn advantage they had by putting on to E3. So now they play D5, which I don't find to be that demanding of a move. I don't think it really allows anything. D5 does open up the light squared bishop. It does allow for knight B7. But neither of those moves particularly interest me because you'd have to develop your bishop passively. And because if you were to develop to a square like F5 or something, white in this position would have G4, and if you were to develop it to G6 for some reason, they'd have H4, H5. So it would be uncomfortable, and you would lose a few tempo. But they develop their knight next, as you'll see. They develop their knight, and then long castles. And I think the only reason for B5, which I don't find to be that necessary, is to stop knight A4, knight C5. That's something that they thought a little too hard on, I think, because I don't think that's a problem. I personally don't find knight c5 to be too big of an issue because you would just take and then they would take, and now there's a pawn on c5, and there's sack pawns on c5. They're now threatening your queens, then you would take on d2, and then they would take back on d2 with their rook. And now their rook is on the second file, which is really good. And other than that, I don't really see anything that's particularly bad for Black in that variation, because almost none of their pieces are developed, but they do have those super strong pawns in D5, B5, and C6. And yes, there's a pawn on C5 that's really hard to remove, but actually it's not hard to remove at all because that pawn on D4 is going nowhere. So you could just play a move like E6, and then you could develop your bishop in taking the pawn. Actually, that pawn... My visualization's a little bad because I just realized that's the pawn that's on the C5, so D5 is on C5 now. So now the bishop is protecting that square, so you may want to play something like... No, that's just a really hard pawn to remove, which... I guess maybe why Black didn't like that position if they saw it. But now there's rook to e1, and now Black's obvious idea is to play knight to c4. And it's originally was to fork... Wow. Sorry. Originally it was to fork these two pieces, the bishop and the queen. But now that the bishop's moved, and I'm not sure how accurate this move is, because the best move in this position is to take the knight. So I'm not completely sure about how great that move is. And the thing I don't like about taking the knight, the reason that it could maybe be seen as a computer move, is because if you take the knight, your light squares, particularly in the center and around your king, are horrible. You lose your light squared bishop, and then their light squares are all locked up around like the queen side where your king is castled. Believe it or not, that's still +1, but it's I guess maybe that could be why it's not a human move. Instead, they played this. They see the pin on the king, and they realize that they could double take the knight. So if they were to, let's say they played something like H6, you would take on F6, and then they would take back with the pawn, and you would take back with your queen. And now there's this huge threat of taking the rook. And if they move the rook, then there's this huge threat of taking on c6. And if you take on c6, you're forking the king and the rook again. And if they were to block it with their queen, then that's just not a super great position because they're blocking with their queen, so then you would take the rook. If they block with their bishop, obviously you can no longer take the rook, but you can take on d5, and that's just not a super comfortable position for black either. So I think that's what they calculated. However, black played the best move, which was e7, defending the knight by just. By the way, they just trade off the knight at the wrong time because this is no longer +1. This is just plus 0.5. So they're now double attacking the knight, and what black saw was, okay, I'll just play e6 and, obviously protect it with their queen, and that was the right move. This was not actually this was the right move. I couldn't remember the eval. This is significantly better for black. This is like plus or minus 0.6 or something like that, which, if you just look at the board, yes, black has no development, but their control over the key squares is huge. And in order to stop a move like e5, I'm pretty sure this is to stop e5, which e5 isn't really a threat in this position. If you were to play like, I don't know, h3, e5, then takes, and yes, there's the idea of like the rook checking, but you could block it and then like keep going on your way. You could also just move your king. And I feel like it's really not a bad position at all. Because you still have that pawn on c6 that hasn't fallen. So you have like a huge queen side presence. So e5 wouldn't cause a problem for either side, I feel like. And then this feels like the obvious move, but I would argue this just isn't a good move. I would have, in this position, probably played something like bishop d6 to attack the piece, which I guess that does the same thing. And a bishop d6 also enables e5 some more, but I'm not completely sure about how that would be for black. Regardless, though, they play g3, which is basically a forced move, because if you were to play rook e2, I could probably find some variation where the rook would be overworked and you would like end up just trading down a few pawns and really just not do great. So yeah, g3 was almost forced, and I don't know if it's in this position, but after this, there's the brilliant move knight to d5, because the pawn is pinned, and you're threatening two major forks. You're threatening a fork on f6 by taking the pawn or forking the king and the rook, which obviously can be covered by king to f7. So you would much rather have that fork on c7, which just wins the rook. And the only move I found that like stops both is king to f7. It stops you from taking the pawn, and it also stops you from threatening the rook on on c7. So while there probably is a better move out there, it also unpins the king. So I found that to be a very great thing. But they play knight to f3, which I'm not sure if this is the best move. It is good. It does develop a knight. And they play, for some reason, knight to b5. I was really confused, to say the least. Knight to b5 almost invites the rook to go onto the b file and just basically take all of it. And if it goes on the b file, then there are like ideas of moving your bishop and the other rook down there. You could maybe play like h5, h4, and then threaten that pawn, and if they move it, you obviously get to take, and it could be a little messy for white. And they defend both forks, or they defend the fork. There's not both forks in this position. They defend the fork, in my opinion, in a very awkward fashion. And a6 just kicks the knight away, but it is inviting this fork as well. And the thing about this fork that's really interesting is if you block it... Sorry, my chair is incredibly loud. If you block it with the bishop, to block what... Sorry, I'm a little lost. If you were to play something like rook to e7, there would be that fork on c7 where by like the knight, where the rook would end up pinned, and you would also be attacking the other rook. So then you would trade down, and you'd be up a lot of material. Um, and then there's also a problem of blocking with the. There's also the problem of like knight to d6 fork, which I think might be a lot worse because then there's king to d7. You take the rook. Maybe they take the knight, and then you have rook to. That's an interesting variation. I can't quite see it though. Regardless, none of that happens because they just take, and I'm not sure why this might be better. Obviously, they're now aiming at the A pawn, but they're allowing white to take their king, and they didn't take back, which, because it's a double check. Sorry, my brain. It's a double check, so they couldn't take back. And then they obviously just have to move their knight away, and any other place they moved their knight would get it taken or trapped. So then they take on a2, which is a very logical move, but you're inviting the king to a square it wants to be on more, because now there are no threats of like bishop to h6. Bishop to h6 could have been a little weird for white, because there's that check, and then it could move into other awkward things. And now h3. I mean, you're trying to progress your pawns up the board, you're trying to win the game. So then they played g4, which was invited by the bishop, and I'm not completely sure why. It looks like I don't see anything different in this position than what we would have started with. Regardless, black plays. By the way, I would like to say I think black is winning in this position, and white actually won this game. So I'm not completely sure what went wrong, and we'll see. But in order to defend their rook, they just move it up a square, and now this looks like a devastating attack from black. This just is not a good position at all. They take back, and that's a really weird move. They sacrifice their bishop. I imagine for rook c6 or rook a3. Okay, I guess it wasn't really a sacrifice, but I'm not completely sure what that gains. It definitely doesn't gain a pawn. I think that was a mistake. I'm not completely sure. I might have to check with the engine, but I do think this move, bishop c3 check, was a mistake. And it's a little weird to say the least, because yes, you win back material after a3 check or rook a3 check, but you don't really gain anything else. There's no like positional advantage. In fact, they're threatening to take your pawn. So I'm not completely convinced of black's position here. Yeah, I think black has suddenly caused a draw. I think, I think black did this to stop to stop what actually? I'm not completely sure. I think maybe to go back onto h8 and threaten the pawn, and then do this for some reason. Black in this position probably should take on h8 with their bishop, I think. That would be my guess. But taking with their rook, I'm pretty sure this is a draw. No, white wins because of this h pawn. Yeah, so this is a huge throw from black. I'm convinced of that. I could copy and paste this really quick into Lee chess, I think, or into chess table or chess base, and because again, this is just I'm not super convinced that like black did particularly horrible until those last moves. Allow me to find the PGN and we will go over it a little more. Download, open. Okay, and let me begin to share this screen. Once I can find them. Okay. Alright. I now have the thing open, and I would like to check with the engine promptly. Okay. So let's take a look at using Stockfish. What might have gone wrong? Okay, here it says white is slightly better. Because apparently, yes, I was complete. So I did this recording like 3 times. D5 is the significantly better, or is a threat, but they say G6 or C6 is the better move in this position. Or G6 is the better move in this position because they played C6. C6 is obviously threatening D5, and when the computer is given time to think, it does think. But then they play an inaccurate move that just gives white the upper hand. Bishop takes, and now this is just better for white. Let's see. Okay. So, yes, this was an inaccuracy. I mentioned this during my original analysis, because it's kind of a one-move threat. It's not really anything. They want white to play h4, just waiting on black to play c4 or knight c4 and then take, I believe. Of course, that's very computer-like move. This is a blunder, apparently. Bishop takes, and then knight g to e2 to threaten what? I'm not completely sure. I guess not to allow this. That'd be awkward. They still want h4 for some reason, probably to anchor the piece. Regardless, they played e6 after this. Bishop takes c4 was right. And then they want queen e3, which obviously didn't happen, and black is almost a little better in this position. Because after queen takes f6, they want queen c7. They want to keep the queens on the board. And actually, I think the engine recommended this. Queen c7, threatening the check on c6. And there's not really a super great way to stop it, because if you play something like bishop d7, then it's just kind of like the queen is there, So, but they play an inaccurate move, and actually says black starts to be better here. F4 was the right move, I suppose. If you play G3, they say king F7. Anyway. Yeah, they say king F7. Black is still slightly better in this position. They want rook B8. Rook B8. Interesting. Okay. Regardless, right here they want they're thinking about d takes c5. D takes c5 to me is not an impressive move. Instead, knight f3 was more accurate. And here knight takes d5 is the move to win. And they blunder it here. Now it says black is just winning. And it equalized after this move. This was a blunder as well. Because of knight takes... It says knight nf takes d4. So what they played. And it equalized. And now knight takes e6, which happened. Now that's interesting. They say a takes b5 or bishop takes e6. And it says bishop takes e6 is incredibly winning for white. I'm not completely sure why. Regardless, this was an inaccuracy. But I feel like black was winning in the endgame. This was a blunder because it invited g4. White is actually winning here. Black is playing most of the right moves other than that. And interesting enough, white was actually winning in this position. Obviously, white was winning in the end, but I thought with all the pieces swarming the white king, that the white king was in some trouble. I suppose not. They say bishop c3 is the best move. And then rook a3 check, taking g3. And then h6 or king g6. So they started playing all the right moves. It's just that it was a little Awkward. Anyway, I apologize for such a long analysis. Um, I appreciate it if you watched the whole thing, and I just wanted to go over this game because I found it to be a little interesting. I'm using YouTube because Loom is bad. Uh, Thank you.